The next topic in our series of lectures on Beecham and Childress's principle of non-maleficence is on the topic of non-treatment. In this section, Beecham and Childress give us a number of distinctions that are used to justify non-treatment. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at each one individually and talk about why Beecham and Childress call them into question or critique them, and why they ultimately defend their view, which is the optional versus obligatory treatments distinction. Is the distinction between withholding versus withdrawing treatment. You probably have a visceral reaction thinking that withholding treatment is morally justifiable, whereas withdrawing it, taking it away once you've started, is not. And what Beecham and Childress want to say is, even though we have this visceral reaction that withholding is permissible and withdrawing is not, that ultimately this distinction fails for a number of reasons. They talk about how feelings of reluctance about withdrawing treatments are understandable, but the distinction between withdrawing and withholding treatments is morally irrelevant and potentially dangerous. So for this distinction, what Beecham and Childress want to say is that both starting and stopping a treatment can be justified depending on the circumstances. Ultimately, if we rely too heavily on this distinction, we get situations of overtreatment and undertreatment. So overtreatment is when we continue a treatment that is no longer beneficial or is even desirable for the patient. And then undertreatment is when we don't authorize certain technology that would be beneficial, because we think if we start this, it's actually just delaying the inevitable. And there are some treatments that, especially with palliative care, right, that would be beneficial for a patient, even though it's not necessarily going to improve their ultimate outcome. So I really like this one example in the text about the pacemaker getting turned off for a father who had dementia. The case as it's presented in the text says how this one woman was trying to get her father's pacemaker turned off because he had dementia. His quality of life had diminished significantly, and this pacemaker was just a way in which that he would be kept alive when it seemed like it was in his best interests to withdraw this type of treatment. Or in this case, it sounded like they would actually go in there and cut it out. It's just a deactivation. And what the family, because the mother was also pressing for this as well, when they requested the deactivation of the pacemaker, the physician ultimately refused, and we get this quote saying that it would have been like putting a pillow over his head, right? The idea is that we have this, again, visceral reaction to withdrawing treatment, but it might not actually be in the patient's best interest. And so Beecham and Childress really want to stress that if a caregiver makes decisions about treatment using this distinction, or allows a surrogate to make such a decision, the caregiver is morally blameworthy for the negative outcomes. So this is Beecham and Childress's argument. If you don't agree with it, my suggestion would be to build an argument against it. But I think that Beecham and Childress do have a very good case to be made here, that ultimately healthcare providers are required to look out for the best interests of their patients. We'll talk about that later in the semester as well. And just living by this withdrawing versus withholding treatment distinction tries to defer that responsibility to uphold that expectation to some artificial distinction that doesn't necessarily hold. Now let's look at the distinction between ordinary versus extraordinary treatments. So it rests on this question: are healthcare providers obligated to try every possible treatment intervention? And the way in which this gets divided up, ordinary treatments are those that are usual or customary. They're considered the standards by which the field thinks that we have an expectation to all patients. And then there are the extraordinary treatments, which go above and beyond. These are the unusual or uncustomary ones. If you ever watch a TV show about medicine, they're filled with instances in which the healthcare providers pursue these extraordinary treatments, right? The whole idea here for using this distinction is that ordinary treatments are expected, we're obligated to fulfill them, whereas extraordinary ones are considered optional. So just like with the withholding versus withdrawing treatment, the whole idea between ordinary versus extraordinary treatment is to create this line in the sand that says if it's an ordinary treatment, then we're obligated to do it. If it's extraordinary, then it becomes optional, and so we don't have to actually provide it to a patient. But this distinction is problematic because how do we even begin to interpret what counts as ordinary versus what counts as extraordinary? And as Beecham and Childress mention in this section, the terms ordinary and extraordinary are very context sensitive, meaning that a treatment that's considered ordinary today wouldn't necessarily be considered ordinary 20 years ago. They would be considered extraordinary. So the shifting standards and the change in technologies mean that this whole idea of what counts as ordinary and extraordinary would always be fluid, and it's not a good measure of what our expectations are to different patients. Ultimately, at the end of the day, as Beecham and Childress will say on a number of occasions, our responsibility is to fulfill, to act in such a way that uphold or ensure that the patient's best interests are met. Let's look at the distinction between sustenance technology and medical treatments. So the question is there a difference between removing a feeding tube versus removing a respirator? Sustenance technologies are associated with providing food and water, so the question is, if we remove these feeding tubes, that would be saying that it's okay to remove sustenance care, but it's not okay to remove medical treatments like a respirator or something like that. In the text, Beecham and Childress give you 3 different cases: a nursing home case where a woman kept removing her feeding tube and it became almost impossible to insert, and so ultimately the staff decided to just not reinsert it. Then you had the respirator removal case where a patient who was on a respirator had the respirator removed, but then was still sustained with medically administered nutrition and hydration. And then you have this vegetative state case where the question was, is it permissible to remove the sustenance technology and allow the patient to pass away? And so there's this argument about, are we obligated to always provide this sustenance technology because it seems to be basic fundamental food, access to food and water, versus medical treatments, which might seem extraordinary in some situations. And Beecham and Childress, as with the other ones, and as they do with these next couple distinctions, argue that there is no morally relevant difference here with this distinction, that both sustenance technology and medical treatments are both life-sustaining technologies, and the right to refuse one type of treatment should be just equally as justifiable to sort of refuse or withdraw the other type of treatment, because ultimately our responsibilities are not bound to what type of treatment is being provided. It's sort of bound up with this responsibility to, again, uphold our patient's best interests. Next, we'll look at intended effects versus merely foreseen effects. Hopefully you remember the doctrine of double effect when we were talking about the moral theories earlier in the semester. So with the natural law theory, we talked about this doctrine of double effect. Here, Beecham and Childress refer to it as the rule of double effect. And the idea is that performing a bad action to bring about a good effect is never acceptable. But performing a good action may be acceptable even if it produces a bad effect, as long as the bad effect is not what is intended. So we have these 4 different conditions to satisfy the rule of double effect that Beecham and Childress go through here. And so the first one is the nature of the act must be good. Second is the agent must only intend the good effect. the bad effect must not be a means to the good effect, and the good effect must outweigh the bad effect. So if you recall when we were doing the trolley problem variation where you're standing on top of a bridge and you push somebody in front of the trolley to save the 5 people, right? The nature of the act probably is not good in that situation, but you're trying to produce the good of saving 5 over 1, but the bad effect is obviously foreseen. You know what you're doing. You are pushing this person onto the track, and it's not just a means to produce this good effect. And so the good effect must also outweigh the bad effect. If you're utilitarian, you could argue for that with that variation of the trolley problem. But Beecham and Childress then go on to talk about this example of therapeutic abortion. I'm not going to go through it right now. You can definitely look it up in the reading if you're interested. But since we're going to do a whole week on abortion, I'll save that for later. But just the highlights of what you would find in the text is this idea of with therapeutic abortion, meaning the cases in which you're protecting the maternal life in these situations, right? And Beecham and Childress look at how all 4 of these different conditions might be engaged with if this is going on. And they sort of come to the realization that all of these different conditions are obviously controversial. It seems as though it's a performance or mental gymnastics to a certain degree to justify whatever outcome you were already thinking. And so it's sort of hard to satisfy these 4 conditions, and just saying that I didn't mean to bring about this when obviously somebody with maybe better foresight would have seen it. There's a whole issue with whether or not this would be a situation of negligence, right? Somebody who is negligent may not have any attendant effects. They might just be merely foreseen for some people. And so for Beecham and Childress, they're talking about how this whole distinction, it's invoked to justify claims that a single act, which has one good effect and one harmful effect, is not always morally prohibited, but it still rests on this distinction that is easily complicated. It's a weird way of phrasing that, but at the end of the day, as you've heard me say in pretty much every slide up to this point, this is just an easier way to avoid the harder discussion about what is the patient's best interests and how do we uphold them. And by just making this false distinction between intended effects and merely foreseen effects is just a way to escape responsibility for that. So you're going to get tired of me saying it, but it always comes down to the best interests of the patient. Let's look at the distinction between optional versus obligatory treatments. This is Beecham and Childress's preferred distinction, and it rests on quality of life judgments to ultimately dictate if a treatment is optional or obligatory. Beecham and Childress argue that we have a prima facie obligation to treat patients unless one of 2 conditions are in play. So the first one being that the treatment is futile or pointless. When we're saying that a treatment is futile, what we're saying is the situation is such that we have an irreversibly dying patient that has reached a point in which further treatment provides no physiological benefit, or it's hopeless. And at this point, it becomes optional because of this futility. Although we want to stress that palliative interventions, end-of-life care that bring comfort to the patient are likely still obligated, but these other types of treatments that are trying to continue life are not necessarily obligated. There are these different competing conceptions and ambiguity of what futility means, which makes it difficult. We should generally avoid the term futility in favor of more precise language. And so this isn't a surefire way to escape the hard work of deciding what's in the patient's best interest, but the idea is that if there's a determination that the situation is futile, then it seems like we are not obligated to provide that treatment. And Beecham and Childress argue, this is their position, that a genuinely futile medical intervention, one that has no chance of being efficacious in relation to accepted goals, is morally optional and in many cases ought not be introduced or continued. So if a treatment is not going to serve the patient's best interests by alleviating harms, then in that case, the treatment is no longer obligatory, it becomes optional. And then with the burdens of treatment outweighing the benefits, that is just another situation that is supposed to call into question the distinction between withholding versus withdrawing. So if you remember, the idea is that we have this visceral reaction to withdrawing treatment because it feels like we are directly causing somebody's death, when if we just withhold it, it's not like it's our fault. And what Beecham and Childress want to say here is that if the benefits are if the harms outweigh the benefits, then there is sort of a necessary expectation that we only see that treatment as optional rather than obligatory. This ultimately rests on quality of life judgments because we want to make sure that we're looking out for our patient's best interests. Yes, I will keep repeating that. But the question is, how do we formulate these quality of life judgments? Who makes them? So Beecham and Childress talk about that when we are trying to formulate these quality of life judgments, it is impossible to determine what will benefit a patient without presuming or presupposing some quality of life standard and some conceptions of the life the patient would live after the medical intervention. But a judgment about whether to use life prolonging measures rests unavoidably on the anticipated quality of life of the patient and cannot be reduced to a standard of what is medically indicated. So the idea here is that we are trying to say, we're trying to look out for the patient's best interests, and if it's this quality of life judgment, we have to be very careful about not trying to say that there's some abstract generalizable quality of life that everybody aspires to. It really requires some of the more critical reasoning or critical examination of the patient, what their interests are, and whether or not the intervention or the treatment is actually fulfilling what those interests are, and we're looking out for them. And here we have the issue of like who ultimately makes these quality of life judgments. Ideally, the patient would be able to let us know what they think what type of quality of life that they want to have, and if it dips down below that, then treatments become optional rather than remaining obligatory. But in cases where, say, somebody is unable to communicate what their quality of life judgments are about themselves, then you can usually hopefully find some sort of proxy that would know about the patient's interests and be able to speak to them. And we'll talk a little bit more about surrogate decision making here in another lecture. But there's also the situation in which we have never competent patients, and in those situations it might be best to use a reasonable person standard to decide the best option. This is all just to say that the two important terms or distinctions that are being used to make this distinction operational are futility and quality of life judgments here. And both of them are not necessarily precise. They require a lot of critical reflection. And so what Beecham and Childress, what they're trying to say is that it is difficult to make these evaluations, but this is ultimately the distinction that is rooted in the patient's best interest. Let's finish up with our customary summary. So we had these different distinctions. The first one was withholding versus withdrawing treatments. So any justification to withhold treatment should apply to withdrawing treatment. That's Beecham and Childress' position. And then we had ordinary versus extraordinary treatments. This is the idea that there are certain norms and you are expected to do what the field considers ordinary treatments, but going above and beyond that, those seem to be optional, those extraordinary treatments. And so this is a very vague distinction according to Beecham and Childress. Then we have sustenance technologies, which are the ones that provide food and water, versus medical treatments. Some people argue that sustenance technologies are not necessarily medical, or they're non-medical. And what Beecham and Childress have to say about this one is that there's no real reason to distinguish between various types of life-saving treatments. Then we revisited the rule of double effect, or the doctrine of double effect, when we were talking about intended effects versus merely foreseen effects. And so Beecham and Childress give us the example of therapeutic abortion and tell us arrive at the conclusion that each of the four conditions are controversial, and they are ultimately sort of a way to avoid the more difficult question about like what's in the patient's best interests and which patient we are most concerned with. And then finally, we have the distinction between optional versus obligatory treatments, and these ones are based on quality of life judgments. This is ultimately the distinction that Beecham and Childress suggest when we are thinking about non-treatment.